Good morning. Welcome to another art lesson. In our previous lessons, we looked at linear perspective, the types of linear perspective, and how generally linear perspective works. And we also learned that linear perspective is simply a perspective that uses lines to create an illusion of space or distance on a flat surface. So that is just one type of perspective that we looked at. Remember, we said there are four main types of perspective that artists employ in their work. Okay, so linear perspective is done. We are remaining with the other three types of perspective. So the ones that we are remaining with are atmospheric perspective, which is also known as aerial perspective. We have overlapping perspective and foreshortening. So these are the ones we are looking at today. So let's start with atmospheric perspective, or should I say aerial perspective. Now, artists have always wanted to create convincing distance or depth in their work. And atmospheric perspective is one type of perspective that artists try to employ in their work. Okay, so what is this atmospheric perspective? The thing with atmospheric perspective is that the atmosphere has got so many gases. The atmosphere is composed of so many gases, and the understanding is that these gases have an effect on how we see colors of objects that are in this space, in this surrounding space. Okay. The understanding is that the further the object, the lighter it is. Okay. So the thing is, objects that are closer to the viewer's eye usually have strong color intensity. The strength of colors or color is quite strong when compared to those that are away from the viewer's eye. And what normally happens is that these distant or objects that are in the distance will appear pale and a bit blue, will appear bluer or bluish, so to say. Colors tend to take a more cooler side as they get away from the eye of the viewer. So that's the understanding of atmospheric perspective. Objects that are closer to the viewer's eye will have strong color intensity. Then as you move back in distance, the intensity or the strength of the color is actually reduced. So it will appear foggy, a bit misty, or should I say pale. And that's what normally happens in atmospheric perspective. So that's just one aspect of atmospheric perspective. So the atmospheric perspective has two aspects. One where you look at loss of color intensity because of the increased distance. Then there's another one that looks at details. So with details, the understanding is that objects that are closer to the viewer's eye will show all the details, or you'll be able to see more details. But as the distance increases, the details are somehow lost in an image. So if you want to work on atmospheric perspective, you try to employ those two aspects. Reduce the color and reduce the details as the distance increases. Let's take a look at the images that we have here. Okay, and let's look at it in the sense of color. If you look at the beginning of this image, you can actually see the greens. Okay. Then is it the hills or the mountains that are beyond this first part? You notice that the green is actually lost. The colors start looking pale until they fade completely. Okay, so that's one aspect of atmospheric perspective. It's the same thing if you look at the trees on this image that is on the right hand side. The first tree, you can see the strong color But as the distance increases, the color intensity is reduced. Okay, and that's what you need to do when you're working on atmospheric perspective. It's the same thing with details. If you look at the first tree, you can actually see the texture of the tree, you can actually see the bark, the roughness, and so on. But as the distance increases, all those details are lost in the image. Or you can see simple shapes, and that end up giving you a foggy or misty feel. It's the same thing with the hills. You can see the grass, the distance increases, you can't actually see those details that are present in the image. So, and that's how atmospheric perspective works. Let's now move to overlapping perspective. Overlapping perspective is a very simple type of perspective. It involves placement of objects in a composition. Now, with this one, some objects have to be placed in front of other objects, and the ones that are in front partially cover objects that lie behind. Now, that simple idea of partially covering an object that is behind and placing another object behind is enough to create an illusion of distance in a composition. As simple as that. So instead of having objects put on the same plane, some objects have to be placed behind, and that's how you create that illusion of space with overlapping. So if you look at this composition here, you have a sphere, you have a small cube, you have a pyramid behind, there's a bigger cube behind, there's a cone, there's a cylinder. So you find that the sphere here partially covers the two objects that are behind, the cone and the bigger cube that is behind. So this is enough to make the eye take a short walk behind, and that in itself is enough to create an illusion of distance. Okay, so you've seen how it works. So whenever you're making a composition and you'd want the eye of the viewer to wander around the composition, make use of overlapping perspective. The eyes will be made to move to the front, and at some point made to move behind, simply because some objects have been placed behind. So that's how you create an aspect of realism in a composition. Okay, so now let's look at the last type of perspective, which is foreshortening. Foreshortening is another interesting type of perspective, mostly used in animation and comics and many other things where an artist wants to create a lot of excitement with these unusual views. Okay, so foreshortening normally happens whenever you view something at a very unusual angle, okay, or something is pushed towards the viewer's eye, and that's when foreshortening normally happens. Now, the understanding in foreshortening is that anything that looks towards you, the viewer, or anything that is projected towards the viewer will look shorter. Okay, so the feature that is projected towards the viewer will appear very big compared to every other part of the figure. Okay, so features that move towards the viewer will appear extremely big, and this brings about some kind of exaggeration or distortion in the entire figure because of one part of the body that looks extremely big when compared to the others. Okay, so if you look at this gentleman who is looking up, meaning that the viewer is up somewhere, what seems to be projecting towards the viewer's eye is the head and the shoulders. These seem to be closer to the viewer, and as a result, these parts or these features will appear extremely big. And everything that lies in between is kind of reduced because of the angle. This is someone who is looking up straight into the viewer. And because of that, certain parts are hidden, and that brings about the compression or distortion in the entire figure. Let's look at the other gentleman who has pushed his hand towards the viewer. So the fist is the one that is closer to the viewer. Okay, and because of that, you notice that this fist appears to be bigger than the head and some other parts of the body. It's extremely big, actually. It distorts, it brings in that kind of distortion. Okay, this is simply because the fist is on a different plane, and the entire body is also on a different plane. So the one that moves towards the viewer's eye, because it's too close, it will appear extremely big. And that's all about foreshortening. Okay, so if you want to bring in a bit of excitement and a bit of interest in your composition, instead of working on figures in a more traditional way, you can apply some of these techniques in your drawing. Okay, so I hope you've understood or you got something from today's lesson. So we've looked at linear perspective, we've looked at overlapping perspective, we've looked at atmospheric perspective, and foreshortening. So whenever you are making a composition, try as much as possible to bring in perspective in your work. This is the only trick that works whenever you want to create an illusion of space, or you want to bring an aspect of realism to your work. Okay, so you can do your practice, see how best you can work out something in all the techniques that we've looked at in perspective. Thank you so much, until next time.